Hi, welcome once again to another session. Myself, Adrian Bell, and today I'm talking to my colleague. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Andrew Prescott from the University of Glasgow.
Welcome, Andrew. I think this session we're going to look at the idea of how the rebellion we look at in 1381 in England is related to European rebellions. So how do you see it, the rebellion of 1381 in relation to associated rebellions, or let's say, are there associated rebellions in Europe?
In order to understand what happened in 1381, we can't view it in isolation just as what happened in England. We have to look at it in its wider European context. And it is very remarkable that during the period really from 1340s onwards, there was this upsurge of wider popular revolts in Europe, ranging from the enormous rebellions in Flanders, where the prompted initially by rural disturbances, city-states there rebelled against the Count of Flanders and tried to align themselves with France. Through to popular uprisings such as the Toussaint in the south of France, or the major riots in Rouen and in Paris after the revolt, or famous rebellions in Italy, such as the Ciompi in Florence. So there's a whole upsurge of what my colleague Sam Cohen calls lust for liberty in Europe at that period. And we can't view what happens in 1381 in isolation from that. Now, it used to be thought that in some way, maybe these disturbances marked a transition from a feudal society towards a more capitalist society, and that these were part of the birth pangs of a more modern society. I think we don't take such a rigid view of feudalism anymore, and we don't necessarily see it as a straight leap into capitalism. I think to some extent that idea has receded, but I think we've noticed a lot of things that are there in common between these European risings. It's partly obviously changed economic circumstances in the wake of the Black Death, partly shifts in the nature of state power, and probably, and I think increasingly we're starting to appreciate this as a factor, the impact, particularly in Northern Europe, of major warfare and the social tensions that created. Broadly, all that seems to also suggest, and I think it's very important to remember, that there's a sort of political culture which is much wider than we used to think of it. I mean, we always used to think of medieval politics in some ways as a sort of Games of Thrones situation, where you've got the knights and the aristocracy floating on top of a sort of almost subhuman peasant population who were just tilling the soil. What we started to appreciate is as a much more integrated and lively, more widely based political community, and that the common people were very aware of and very engaged in wider political cultures, and that we should look at that wider political culture. And within that wider political culture, there were traditions of protest and resistance that fed into this upsurge of popular movements in Europe in the later Middle Ages. So I think where the comparisons with 1381 lie is that they're all expressions of a more broadly based political culture, which has a greater social basis, and which reflect the impact of immediate events, particularly warfare. I think the parallels with warfare are very important. Beyond that, I think we could actually suggest also that there are direct links between some of these disturbances. And this is something that I think we've become very much more conscious of in recent years. Indeed, colleagues at University of York, Queen's University Belfast have drawn attention to the way in which Edward III actively encouraged people who were exiled after the revolts in Flanders to settle in England, and that this was actually then paradoxically one of the major economic grievances which fed into the 1381 revolt. And indeed, it's very strange that one of the exiled Flemish rebels who settled in London was amongst those who was victims of the revolt in 1381. So there's kind of wheels within wheels. Similarly, there were complaints that many rebels had fled overseas, fled to France probably, after the revolt in 1381. And in 1382, we then have major disturbances in Rouen and in Paris. And it's difficult to believe that they're not in some way influenced by the events that are going on in England. So there are cross connections between these, and to some extent, we have to interpret them all as related movements.
And I think this gives us an opening to talk about some new findings. I know our colleague Justine is looking at the French episode, and you had mentioned to me about clergy, didn't you? You mentioned to me about the clergy, Andrew, and the different uses, the different involvement of the clergy in both episodes.
Well, we used to draw a great contrast between the Jacquerie, the great French popular rebellion of 1356-8, which is a huge rebellion across much of central and northern France, which was seen as being very chaotic, disorganized, quite criminal in its outlook. We used to draw a contrast between that and what went on in England in 1381, which was seen as more highly organized, much more direct in its political demands, and a much more structured revolt. I think what our work on 1381 is doing is suggesting that the structure is much more complex, and what the work of Justine Ferdhaber-Baker at the University of St Andrews has suggested is that the Jacquerie was actually much more structured than we previously thought. In both cases, they're both very much driven by the impact of war and the impact of campaigns in the different areas. So we're kind of seeing those two revolts moving closer together. One of the things that's interesting is to contemplate what's distinctive about 1381 by comparison with other European revolts. And my colleague Sam Cohn at the University of Glasgow has suggested that there was actually very little involvement of clergy and people with religious affiliation in the disturbances in Europe. And what we're finding very strongly with our revolt in 1381 is that there's an enormous clerical participation. A lot of that may not be driven by religious motives. It may be driven by concern about jurisdictions, about ecclesiastical preferment, or the effects of legislation like the Statute of Labourers. But it's a very distinctive feature of what we're finding in 1381, and does sort of start to raise questions about what's unusual about the revolt in England in 1381.
Thanks, Andrew. That's very helpful.